I have a story to tell you about this land where we're gathered here. It's a story that goes back a very long time, through thousands of years of forest development, followed by 150 years of rapid change. I offer the story to you as a gift, in case it may help all of us, as it has certainly helped me, to extend our roots deeper into the soil and the place we all live, to develop a deeper sense of place and an awareness for the web of life within which we are all embedded. And I like to begin the story by personally acknowledging that we're gathered here on the traditional unceded territory of the Coast Salish First Nations. Myself, probably like many people in this room, I was not born here. My great-great-grandfather was a settler from Scotland. He left a very tough life there as a landless sheep farmer and a fisherman to try his luck immigrating to Canada and took to farming the prairies. So he was relatively successful because many generations later I was born in Saskatoon. Saskatoon is a pretty place in case you've ever been there, but it's pretty flat too. There's not a whole lot of forest. So I often joke that the luckiest thing that ever happened to me is that when I was 5 years old, my family picked up and moved us here to Vancouver. And, I much prefer it here. We have the ocean, the mountains, these beautiful rainforests. And I think that when you come from somewhere else, or even if you're from here, but you go away for a while and you come back, you can really appreciate the beauty of the nature here. So I grew up in the neighborhood of Kerrisdale in Dunbar. It's on Vancouver's west side, which is just uphill from the Musqueam Indian Reservation. And, as I get older, looking back, I realized that I had an awful lot of privilege and opportunity growing up here. I got to spend lots of time outdoors, skiing, snowboarding, mountain biking, the usual kind of stuff. But it was around the time I finished high school that I started getting into mountaineering. And I spent about 5 years traveling the world, climbing some of the highest peaks. And when I came home from that trip, I continued climbing in the local mountains, but I realized that something had changed. And it wasn't the mountains themselves that had changed, it was my experience on the way to climb those mountains, hiking through those towering rainforests along the way. These deep, layered rainforests of an almost indescribable green. And sometimes I'd be hiking along and I'd come across a tree like this one here that was just so tall, like you couldn't even see the top of it up in the clouds, right? And you could tell it was so old just by looking at it. But most of the time, I'd be hiking along, I'd see these younger forests, and I'd see these stumps everywhere. And you could tell that the forest was recovering from some terrible logging event of the past. So it was in the forest that I started to get this feeling like, I don't know exactly how to explain it, but it was like there was like lessons embedded, layered into the forest. Like there was things that we could see, but we just didn't know how to interpret it. There was a lot going on. So I started spending a lot more time exploring the forest and looking for the largest and oldest trees of the forest. And I was aware that they were still cutting these big trees down, so I started documenting those that remained. So I just got more and more curious, and I ended up going back to school to learn more. So I did a Bachelor of Science in Forestry at UBC, and then I did a Master's degree at McGill, specifically studying the old-growth forests of our region. And then when I finished school, I went traveling again. But this time not to climb mountains, it was to explore forests, find the biggest and oldest trees of the world. I actually did a bicycle trip from Vancouver to Panama to explore forests along the way. And so through all these experiences, just out hiking, in school, and working towards my professional forestry certification, I've gained a lot of perspective. And I think I've finally started to get some of those lessons that I knew were embedded in the forest. And these lessons extend well beyond just the forest. I think they extend to our relationship with the environment in general. So I'd like to share them with you. And to do that, I'm going to have to take you out into the forest. So the type of forest that we see around us is what we call coastal temperate rainforest. These forests are dominated by long-lived coniferous tree species, such as the Douglas fir, seen here. The Douglas fir can live to be well over 1,000 years old, and it's believed to be the third tallest tree species on Earth, reaching a maximum height of about 100 meters down in southern Oregon. This type of forest is really wet, in case you hadn't noticed. In fact, it rains so much in these coastal temperate forests that wildfires are quite rare, at least in comparison to most other forest types worldwide. And in this absence of fires, the forest is able to get really old. It just gets older and older. And as the forest ages over time, it begins to develop this increasingly layered and complex structure. Eventually, after several hundred years, it develops into what we call an old-growth forest. And it's within these old-growth forests that we find a wide range of values. I'll show you exactly what I mean as we now look into an old-growth forest. So we find large trees with cultural heritage values. We find dead standing trees and dead fallen trees. And these are important to a wide variety of different critters that live in the forest. Of course, all that woody material stores a huge amount of carbon to help regulate the global climate. Those understory plants provide wild edible foods and medicines that First Nations people have used for thousands of years. There's endangered or critical habitat for endangered species, such as the marbled murrelet. Of course, we could cut the forest down to provide timber. And it's only within these really old forests that we find the large western red cedars used in traditional First Nations carving. So in my master's degree, I actually developed a method so that we could go out into the forest and measure these different values. And then we could ask how long it would take them to recover if we cut an old growth forest down. And I just want to highlight really quickly one of our findings. So if you look about halfway along this sequence of forest recovery, you'll see that after about 100 years, a lot of values have recovered. So here we have carbon storage, timber, and dead trees. They've fairly well recovered after about 100 years. But it's not until 125 years that we start to see recovery of marbled murrelet habitat. And it's not until 150 years that we start to see recovery of the large heritage trees. And if you can see that little orange one there, what that shows us is that even after 200 years of recovery, we didn't see any significant sign that those large western red cedars used in traditional First Nations carving were recovering. So let me emphasize then that these old growth forests are really important. And if we manage our landscape primarily to produce timber, we're excluding a lot of these values that are only found in old growth forests. So another point I want to emphasize is that these old growth forests, in the absence of fire, they once covered the vast majority of this region, like almost everywhere. Imagine that even right where we're sitting 150 years ago, there may have once been old growth forest, towering trees, if you can try to imagine that today. For thousands of years, an extensive and particularly productive old growth forest once covered the entire Metro Vancouver region. And it supported a highly productive ecosystem, as well as a large population of Indigenous people who had intricate uses for just about every single plant in the forest, but they very rarely ever felled the great trees, except of course occasionally to make canoes and such. In contrast, when the settlers arrived, they very much saw the forest as a resource that could be exploited to create a market for colonizing. The first sawmill was established not that long ago, about 155 years ago in Moodyville, and then Hastings Mill a few years after that. The city of Vancouver was incorporated in 1886, so it was about 130 years ago. At the time, of course, it was really just a village of a few thousand people, if you can imagine that. But it was in the same year that the Canadian Pacific Railroad was completed, reaching the Pacific shores. And this connected this region to a much larger population center and market in the east. So it ushered in a brand new era of settler in-migration and just explosive growth. Those great trees were rapidly felled off. First Nations people were dispossessed of their land. Those large trees, their stumps, were axed, burned, and often dynamited to try to clear the land for this growing city. And these are some of the stories of our city's past that don't go back that far, but a lot of people have sort of forgot this context. And as I work to sort of uncover these stories and open them up to the public, none are more curious to me as the reports of just how tall the trees once grew. In fact, there's reports of past trees in this region that were much taller than any living tree on Earth today. In particular, the Douglas fir in Lynn Valley and Kerrisdale districts of Vancouver were reportedly over 120 meters in height. That's quite a bit higher than any living tree today. And to put that into scale, can you see the people standing at the base of the tree there? And for further scale, these trees would be more than twice as high as the world's tallest wood building, which was recently completed out at UBC. Of course, we'll never know exactly how accurate these reports were because these trees are long gone. So we can't go verify these measurements were accurate. In their place, a sprawling metropolis of 2.5 million people now covers the region, presumably reducing the old-growth forest to remnants. And a similar situation plays out across the rest of coastal British Columbia. So this map shows that there's very few parts of the south coast that still have over half of their old growth remaining. Those are the areas in green. And the areas in red have less than 10% of their old growth forests remaining. And a point that I want to emphasize is that the old growth forests are continually logged today, if you can imagine that. So as we step back into the present, having witnessed some of what has gone on in the past, I think there's a responsibility that emerges to make sure that going forward we manage our forests more sustainably and much more equitably. And we have much work left to do. The first step is to recognize what has happened and come to terms with it. And then we can take stock of our opportunities in terms of what we want to do with the forest that remains. So first of all, anywhere that forest was cut and left to regrow, we have quite a fascinating biological legacy. We have these huge stumps. The trees that were cut down were so large that even their stumps left behind are quite a sight to behold. These stumps, in particular, the rot-resistant western red cedar, which is what you see here, these are ubiquitous in the forests, in the recovering forests around the Vancouver area. And these stumps attest to how common these big trees once were and how large they were. And what remains of the actual old-growth forests? Well, I'll tell you that it's pretty small compared to what there once was, but there's actually a lot of old-growth forest left. And a lot of it you can easily visit in places you may be very familiar with. In fact, once you're up into the mountains, about 600 meters or so, it's almost all old-growth forests up there. What I want to focus in on today is where I spend most of my time. As an illustrative example, I want to show you a little about the old-growth forests out at UBC. So many people are actually pretty surprised to learn that we have old-growth forests at UBC. Most of this area in green was never cut. So it's not all really old, pristine cathedral forests, but it has remnant old-growth forests in there. And these forests are highly visible, forming this wild ancient skyline seen from across campus. This is taken from the 4th floor of the forestry building. That's where I work. And just outside the front door of our building, you can see one of my favorite trees. That's this guy in the middle here. That's a grand fir. And so it doesn't look like much, but as you approach it, you realize that this tree actually grows out of this deep canyon. And at 64.5 meters high and 1.7 meters diameter, so that's about that thick in diameter, it's believed to be the 3rd largest grand fir in BC. There's lots of Douglas fir right around UBC that are about 400 years old, reaching heights around 50 meters and quite a bit bigger. My arms don't go wide enough to show you how big they are. These ones are just below the UBC Botanical Garden. The biggest tree in UBC, I think, is this one. And this towering Douglas fir rises directly above Wreck Beach, the popular tourist destination. And I don't think that many people know it's there. In fact, I didn't even know it was there until big tree searcher Ralph Kellman showed me. Meet Ralph, everybody. So Ralph has an unwavering appreciation for big trees. Like, he really loves big trees. Him and other big tree searchers, like the ones we heard from today and some that were mentioned, they're driven to discover the largest and oldest trees because they understand the importance of protecting them and sharing their stories with the public to galvanize support for protecting old growth forests across the province. These old trees they're incredibly charismatic. They act almost like a persona that we can relate to with the forest. And many people connect with them, different kinds of people. And I believe that when that connection is formed, people establish like a pathway to connect with nature and form these relationships in a much deeper way. And they also come to understand what's at stake if these forests get cut down. So during my undergrad at UBC, me and my classmates, we became very, very aware of what's at stake. And it's, not just the forest and the old growth forest and all these values associated with the old growth forest, but we were learning about the scope of impacts from climate change and deforestation and rising extinction rates of species around the world. And it was all deeply concerning as a young person to know what kind of trajectory the world is on. So like a lot of people, I had this feeling, right? Like, I need to do something, but I don't know what I could do. But I realized there was an opportunity there in what I was learning about these old trees. And I decided that if I could connect people to these old trees, I could potentially leverage, and so these are old trees right around our cities, right? I could potentially leverage an awareness of old growth forests and environmental issues across the province. And thinking that, half of our population of the province lives in Vancouver, that's half of the voters, that seemed like a real opportunity to galvanize change. So I started leading hikes into the old growth forest. I just started bringing hundreds of people out to go to places like the Temple Giant in Seymour Valley and the Hollyburn Fir in Brothers Creek in West Vancouver, and to see these giant cedar stumps in the Seymour Valley. And that's just a shot at Wreck Beach with the big Douglas fir behind it. So I started bringing people out there, and I saw that people really got a lot out of it. They felt good being in the forest and knowing that this forest still exists. I saw light bulbs go off in some people's heads where they had this perception that there wasn't any old growth forest left at all. Like, there's just thought that it was all gone and it was too late. And here they were looking up at a 1,000-year-old tree that's pretty much right in their own backyard. So, but the hundreds of people I was engaging wasn't enough. So I created a website, and this is VancouversBigTrees.com, the Vancouver Big Tree Hiking Guide. It's been a pretty big project, but through this, I'm able to reach a lot more people. Like, I get about 75 views a day, which isn't a lot, but it adds up over the year to like 30,000 people. And it's growing, so that's good. And so I'll tell you what people find when they go to this website. They'll find maps and directions to go out and visit and experience these forests for themselves to form that personal connection. And they don't have to invest all that time in it like I did, because I'm telling them stories that encompass much of what I've learned. Stories like the one I'm telling you right now. So there's a few lessons I'd like to leave you with that I've learned along the way. The first is that the environmental legacies of what we do today are very long-lasting into the future. And these legacies build cumulatively over time, such as the case that old growth forests are becoming increasingly rare in southern BC, and those values associated with them are becoming increasingly harder to come by. Some of these trees that we're looking at are 1,500 years old. So there's an intergenerational responsibility to steward the environment today. And we need to step up. We need the government to step up. Until those trees are given the protection they deserve, I believe that we need to get people out in the forest and we need to connect them with what's going on. Second, this is our story. I really believe that recognizing our past, including the long history of forests and First Nations people in this region, only enriches our sense of place as people who live here. You know, I grew up believing that Vancouver was this like young city because the only history that I learned was the European history here. And that is not the case. There's stories running all through every single part of this region that stretch back thousands of years. So as settlers, we have to learn to acknowledge the impacts of colonization and the dispossession of land from First Nations people. And we have to come to terms with the fact that we've all benefited from that. So moving forwards towards reconciliation, I believe that one thing we can do is take a greater stewardship role in our local forests. We need to protect those old trees that are remaining, and we also need to nurture those young forests that are recovering. And so the last lesson I want to leave you with is that looking beyond all of these losses that have occurred, nature does prove resilient. We might get a second chance at this, it's not too late. I want to emphasize that. It's not too late to join a different trajectory. So there's forests recovering from logging all over this region that are now approaching sometimes 150 years old. There's lots of forests that are 100 years old in our parks, in our city parks. And I've personally watched those trees get older and bigger, like the trees near my house in Pacific Spirit Park. So we may never know exactly what once was, and we may never get that back. But if we embrace a long-term stewardship perspective and we let those forests grow, then there will be more old growth forests for future generations. So thank you.